Hello, hello, and welcome back to another episode of Overpowering Emotions, where I talk all things big emotions, emotion regulation, and of course, self regulation. We're in the middle of a specific mini series around self regulation. And today I want to talk about leveraging peer support just in terms of promoting that self-regulation, especially for our adolescents. So as they go into those teen years and into early adulthood, it's a really critical period for peer influence, which we know. We know so much is happening in the teenage brain, and there's a lot of emotionality, there's a lot of reward seeking, right? So all of this is going on, and those self regulation abilities are continuing to develop quite significantly. There's a big, huge period of growth here. So during this period, kids are spending about probably more than twice as much time with their peers as with their parents, right? They're spending way more time with them. I remember reading somewhere by the time they're 18, parents will have spent like 95% of their time with their kids by the time they're 18, which is just so sad. And yeah, it's just unbelievable. But anyway, that's a whole other issue. So when we're looking at they're spending so much time with their peers, those peer relationships really become so important for emotional support. They're looking for intimacy and closeness, loyalty, right? That's a major important piece. Teens are also beginning to differentiate their use of emotion regulation strategies based on things like their social emotional context, their motivation, the type of emotion that's coming up for them. So all of these pieces are part of the puzzle to think about. Now, we know successful peer relationships and psychosocial functioning are partly dependent on using adaptive emotion regulation strategies. So we want to make sure we're focusing on those because we see time and time again, kiddos are coming in for their psych ed assessments or they're coming in for counseling. Those kids with self regulation and emotion regulation difficulties, they have trouble maintaining their relationships, right? And so parents and teachers are always talking about how successful their kiddos would be if they didn't say something or do something impulsively, or if they could just manage their emotions, their frustration tolerance, right? If they could just manage that, they wouldn't be driving their friends away. And research shows too that the combined, self-control scores of friends predicts relationship quality. So being able to keep a friend after a conflict requires a kiddo to be able to articulate their feelings, take their friend's, perspective, and maybe there's some forgiveness or some collaboration. I mean, all of these pieces are part of that self-regulation and key parts of emotion regulation skills too. So to be most successful, we really want to make sure, if we can, include the peer co-regulation strategies, especially when they're teens. That really does align with the broader concept of co-regulation, where we're always talking about the supportive processes between adults and teens to help kids understand and express and modulate their thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors. So, if we can extend that framework to peers, that could really be way more effective because peers are such major socializing agents that really contributes to adolescents, their sense of identity, their behavior, their values. They can shape their behavior through reinforcement, right? Leading members of the peer group to become increasingly similar over time. And this is why we see gangs, right? There's loyalty and commitment, and, we're wearing our uniform. It might be a leather jacket or a symbol or emblem, right? Just that belongingness. So we really want to make sure we're creating interventions to intentionally nurture positive peer influences. That's, of course, important, but we want to leverage that natural dynamic to make sure that we're encouraging self-regulatory behaviors and developing those. Kids who are rejected by peers, unfortunately, are going to miss out on a lot of interactions that promote essential relationship skills like, perspective taking and conflict resolution. We know that social emotional learning programs that are in schools already emphasize a lot of key relationship skills, a lot of collaborative learning, but we really need to target these skills within peer contexts very intentionally to enhance that self-regulation and overall social competence. And for older teens who are dating, that's another place where we can focus on co-regulation, where the teens are supporting each other in helpful ways in managing frustration and distress effectively in those relationships, right? Knowing when to seek help, especially if the stress is becoming so overwhelming or if there's dangerous situations. I work with a lot of teens who there is a lot of harming behaviors, self-harming or other harming behaviors, and it can be really problematic. So the focus would really be on co-regulation. We're fostering positive group dynamics, we're enhancing relationship skills to be able to support self-regulation. I am piloting a hybrid school home program, and the social piece in schools is going to be really important where we're targeting, skill instruction through co-regulation strategies. So there is, the foundational self-regulation skills piece in which kids are building their own internal capacity, but doing so in a group of peers can be really helpful to build their own skill set, to practice the skills when they see other kids are doing them as well, to model their own behaviors when other kids are also modeling, but even being like peer mentors. You could even have older kids who are mentoring younger kids too, right? The younger kids are really going to look up to those older kids, and the older ones really want to be a good role model for those younger ones. So there's lots of different, things of those types of things. I still will be getting into the individual skills, but just quickly, if we're looking at those skills that we want to address and leveraging the peer piece, we're looking at emotion regulation, which is always where I focus on that emotional literacy, self-monitoring. We want to start that early, 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 as young as possible, right? I was teaching my kids as soon as they had words. We started doing this in a really sort of crude sort of way. I mean, by the time they were 18 months old, they would be able to say, I'm frustrated. Everything was frustrated, right? For frustrated or mad or, you know, but they would able to were able to articulate how they were feeling, and then they knew what they could do, what they could say to themselves, and what they could do at 18 months old. So from a very young age we can already start teaching some of these things, right? So they really need to learn to recognize and label their own emotions before they can ever hope to effectively manage those emotions in a mindful adaptive way, right? And then teaching the strategic emotion management, right? Looking at different adaptive behaviors to monitor, to evaluate, to modify whatever those emotional responses are that are coming up in an appropriate way. And so it could be thoughts, it could be the physiological feelings. I always start with the physiological feelings because that's usually the most uncomfortable and that's usually what kids want to avoid. So we're really working on the frustration tolerance, the distress tolerance, and management of those feelings, working on impulse control. That includes delaying gratification, right? Choosing the larger deferred rewards over immediate smaller ones. So, for example, no, I'm going to save my money for this car that I really want instead of wasting it all on pizza that I just feel like having right now, right? So, working on that goal setting and problem solving, how do we reach those goals? So, all of those skills are taught in really structured group sessions for peer interaction. So, I would practice those skills. We would have some psychoeducation, but we're going to practice really important skills like mindfulness with peer modeling, right? And having peer led demos of regulation strategies. We're going to use partners to help with self talk and reframing, doing different strategies like double standard, right? You're stressed out and you like, what are you doing? You're getting overwhelmed, studying for a test. Well, what would you tell a friend in that situation, right? And so lots of practice in those types of things. But having those mentors, someone, if you have older kids who learn these skills, if they could be teaching the skills, that would be amazing too, because there's going to be a lot more learning happening there as well. We really do want to have a lot of collaborative skill practice where we're naturally promoting that cooperation, the negotiation, the conflict resolution within the peer group. So, certainly it could be role playing exercises. I would try to use real life experiences, but use some role playing to really help promote some of that perspective taking, the effective communication, right? So we can have those sort of simulated social conflicts. But ideally, if you could use real life conflicts, actually, one of the best groups that I ever had, I worked in a small rural school. It was a middle school. So I had all of the grade 7 and 8 girls. And it was so awesome because I didn't even need to come up with scenarios. We didn't even need to do role playing. We were really playing out all of the drama right there in the room. It was a small group of girls who'd grown up together in elementary, right? There was only a handful because it was such a small school that we were able to play out that drama right there in the room using these strategies. So that was really helpful. That's what we want is that real time, real world, natural environment. Problem solving, right? We can present hypothetical, but again, real life situations. And if we need to anonymize that, that's okay. Or maybe you're having groups of friends together who are kind of working through something right now. So anything related to self-regulation challenges, we're just encouraging them, to brainstorm ideas, do some perspective taking, discussing different strategies or solutions to any problems, right? Potential outcomes for each. If I do this, what's the outcome? If I do this, what's the outcome? Let's go put it into practice. The mutual support and feedback is really powerful. So we want to make sure we're spending a good amount of time promoting positive group dynamics. So there's a sense of camaraderie, that mutual understanding and belonging. That's going to be really important so that we can now encourage kids to discuss what's hard with self-regulation. Maybe they can discuss any successes they've had, with applying some of these skills as well, but also just, the struggles that they're still having. I mean, that alone can really help reduce feelings of isolation, right? So we want to make sure we're coaching them to provide non-judgmental feedback, really good listening, right? So all of that piece is really important. And this is part of the reason why kids often turn to other kids for advice or just to have a shoulder to cry on because they commiserate. Adults, we swoop in, we do all of these things to try to make them feel better. Oh, like I always use the example if someone breaks up with a boyfriend, right? Oh, there's a million other fish in the sea. We try to make them feel better, or we're trying to fix things as adults. Other kids commiserate, right? They're like, oh, he was such a jerk, right? Or that really sucks. I know how it was. They're not trying to fix, right? Or if there's a teacher who's just being a big jerk, like they're going to commiserate over how mean this teacher is. They're not as punishing as adults usually are. So we can really use that, right? And look at how they're each applying, some of those learned self-regulation, emotion regulation strategies effectively. I would really train teens on how to act as those self-regulation coaches. That's really a key piece. It's not just that working on their own, it's how to be co-regulators for one another. So in dyads or small groups where peers are actively helping each other identify stressors and understand those emotional reactions, applying appropriate, coping mechanisms, that can be really helpful. And that's drawing on the idea that self-regulation involves the understanding and responding to stressors, but also, the context around us. And so that piece is so important. And usually when we are teaching skills, we become master of those skills. That's really where the biggest learning comes. And even being able to help our peers, I mean, that's promoting a lot of those pro-social emotions and gratitude and appreciation. And our brain can't tell the difference between receiving support and giving support. It feels good, right? We're promoting all of those good things. So look at how we can start focusing on that and just making sure we're very intentional in creating that group environment where it is all of the positive influences. I think that's the third time I've said that now because it is so important, right? So that they feel like that they can share, but then we're really shaping behavior through reinforcement. So we're celebrating, the collective successes, the individual successes in being able to apply that self-regulation. I mean, we were just reinforcing to do more of those behaviors that we want. And really boosting those relationship skills. So that might involve some of those DBT things that I was talking about a couple of weeks ago, looking at that interpersonal effectiveness, right? So they're learning how to balance their own needs with the needs of others. How do we improve our overall interpersonal success and positive interactions? I want to spend a lot of time explicitly teaching effective communications, and that's really being able to listen and validate the other person's perspective, being able to articulate our own feelings constructively as well, especially during conflicts. That's going to be really important. And if we disagree, how do we disagree respectfully? How do we be assertive versus aggressive or versus passive as well, right? Because sometimes people are just people pleasers and never voice themselves. So how can we balance all of those things, right? Maybe they're creating sort of emotion scripts for handling peer conflict as well. That can be really helpful. We're providing structured methods for navigating and resolving conflicts constructively within those relationships. And we're recognizing that successfully maintaining friendships really depends a lot on these skills because there's going to be disagreements, right? There's going to be conflicts. So they need to really practice this. So we might be simulating really tough situations or using those real world drama situations as well. We really have to make it as experiential as possible because remember, the emotional brain, it's an experiential learner. It's not about sitting and talking, right? So any teaching has to be experientially, but we're also giving lots of regular homework assignments to go and practice those skills in the real world. It might be with their peers, it might be with their parents, it might be with their siblings, whatever that is, right? So we want to make sure there's homework and we're reviewing it in subsequent sessions. And we really want to capitalize on how important that homework is. And again, it's modeling, being able to model. Other kids are doing it, they're doing the homework and seeing each other, the growth that they're all having. That can be really important. We want to make sure that they're self-monitoring their progress towards their goals, right? And hopefully we'll have goals that we're working on as we go through this process. We just want to make sure that they're working on that, they're reflecting about the effectiveness of what they've tried and what they didn't try, right? What's still triggering, what's still hard, where can we go? But really making that peer mentorship role is very valuable, right? So that they're modeling, right? That regulation, they're modeling that vulnerability, they're offering encouragement and perspective taking, they're reflecting on their own learning, right? So if we can really create this framework and this model in schools, that would be fantastic, where they're learning it from kindergarten all the way up to grade 12. But, it's just different. We're taking on different roles. So they would have, yeah, in those early ages, those mentors who are a little bit older. And as they get older, they're taking on more and more mentorship and they're a mentee and a mentor, right? So all of that can be really important. And again, we're always tracking their progress, seeing how they're developing the cognitive skills, the emotion regulation skills, the impulse control, goal setting, all of those things that they're working on. And importantly, the improvement of their social skills, the quality of their relationships, right? So we want to focus on that. Are we seeing a decrease in emotional behaviors? It could be irritability, it could be explosiveness, it could be risk-taking behaviors, right? Are we seeing improvements there? Maybe we're seeing improvements in school. So just a few ideas to think about, but we really want to focus on how can we start really using that. If your families, maybe there's cousins, right? How can you start using peer mentorship within families, right? In the classroom, it's super simple. If you're in a clinic setting, maybe that's how you're scaffolding, right? You're using kids and kind of building that mentorship program. So ideally in the natural world, that's really what we want to do. I'll leave it there for today. I am going to start next week, though, getting into specific skills. I keep talking about all these different things, and I know I've talked about them all in the past, but I really want to dig deep, right? Looking at, especially we'll start with the emotion regulation. So in the meantime, have a great day. Help those kiddos be bold and courageous, and I will see you next time.